Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Right-wing parties are on the rise all across Europe. President Trump has imposed tariffs on EU steel and aluminium exports to the US. In addition, the war in Ukraine shows no signs of a quick resolution, a war which the EU has committed to supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. Despite this turmoil, the EU has reiterated its commitment to bring the Balkan states into the bloc. What next for a sustainable EU strategy? Well, to lay this out for us, we're joined by Heather Grabbe, a senior fellow at Bruegel. Heather, welcome to TVP World, and thank you very much for taking the time.
Great to join you.
Complicated situation, is it not, within the EU at the moment? Lots of moving pieces. Let's start with the US tariffs on EU exports. Impact on EU foreign policy. What do you think?
Well, this is the part of Trump's agenda which was long trailed and which the EU is perhaps best prepared for. Already for quite a few months, the Commission has been preparing retaliation, mirror tariffs, and this kind of thing. And they've already done a lot of analysis of the economic impact on Europe. So I think in this one, the playbook is fairly clear that the EU will reciprocate the tariffs and then they will try to reduce the economic damage in Europe, knowing very well that there is also economic damage from these tariffs in the United States. Let's not forget how many US industries depend on imported aluminium and steel, which is going to get more expensive as a result of these tariffs. So the inflationary impact is the part that it's harder for the EU to deal with because they don't know how far the whole tariff agenda will go and what will be the knock-on effect for all kinds of other prices, not only in the US, but also in Europe. And given the importance of the cost of living in recent elections and in voters' sentiments, the inflationary impacts might be one of the things that are most worrying for Europe.
Certainly. Now, how does that link to parties or countries within Europe, the European Union, who are slowly, showing anti-EU sentiment? Is this simply another stick with which to beat EU membership with? Inflation, is growing. Why are we dependent on EU policies?
Not really on this one. Sure, it's true that all of the members of the Eurozone are bound by monetary policy, which is made by the European Central Bank at EU level, in which all of the national central banks play a role. But on the whole, you don't hear very many politicians calling for a withdrawal from the euro, as, for example, Marine Le Pen did during the financial crisis. And in fact, in general, there are very few politicians who say that their country should leave the EU after the disaster of Brexit. They don't want their economies to be subjected to the same kind of damage. So exit skepticism about the EU is at a very low level right now. What we do see, however, is a real disarray about what should be the EU's responses to Trump. Where should we accommodate him, try not to provoke him, try and survive the next 4 years, but not really oppose him? And where do we need to stand our ground and be very firm and clear? And I think that it's actually rule of law, which is the area where the EU will end up having to stand firm, because the Union is a community of law ultimately. And if politicians do the kind of thing that Trump is trying to do, if we have that in Europe of having attacks on judges, attacks on the independence of the judiciary, especially attacks on regulatory bodies, attempts to politicize and bring state institutions all under the control of one party, it causes havoc in the European Union. And we've seen that happen in Hungary and also in Poland for a while. And the EU was really not quite sure how to respond. But eventually it did get together a response, and events have since changed the situation. But the question with Trump is he's gone to an absolute extreme in overriding the US Constitution, in attacking judges, in using executive orders instead of putting things through Congress, and so on. So the question is, are there leaders in Europe who might try to follow the same path, or will Trump a bit like Brexit, become a watchword for, oh, no, we don't want that here. Oh, no, this could be really damaging for our economy. Oh, this could really disrupt our democracy. This could really mess up our system and deter investment and so on. Trump might be the one who gives a bad name to all of this kind of populist attempts by the executive to take over all the other institutions, because he's following the same playbook that we've seen with Fidesz in Hungary, peace in Poland, but at a much larger country and a much more prosperous economy. So if that results in major problems in the US, that will have an example effect in Europe.
What about the relationship between the US and China and the impact of that on Europe? Trump has imposed tariffs on imports of Chinese goods as well. He's increased tariffs by 10%. Mm-hmm. How does that have a knock-on effect on the EU in terms of its economic situation?
It could do. It depends how China decides to respond. China's economic growth is now very much dependent on continuing exports. So if China can only export less to the United States, then they may wish to send more to Europe. But actually, some of the tariffs, they may actually just be absorbed as costs by the manufacturers. We might see that they may not have a big impact on US consumption of certain Chinese goods. So I think that's the thing to watch. It's really sector by sector how much impact the tariffs have. And also, the other thing is that Trump is at the moment not pushing pressure on European countries to follow him in imposing the same tariffs on China. So there was a lot of concern about this, that EU members, also the UK, would face an ultimatum from the White House saying, you need to follow us and put the same tariffs on. Maybe that will come, but it hasn't come yet. So for the moment, European countries or EU trade policy, because of course this is a common policy, EU trade policy is not directly affected. But let's see, it's only been a little over 3 weeks. So
well, indeed it has. A lot has happened in the first 3 weeks. And as you say, let's see what happens. I mean, in terms of inflation, Trump has said that there will be temporary pain, but he's hoping to attract manufacturing within the US in those industries. Let's see how quickly that happens. Now, let's talk a little bit.
Also just
Sorry,
I think a key question is whether investment starts to flow out of the United States because of all the uncertainty. Because if you've got regulatory uncertainty, you don't know what laws will be applied and what not. If there's crony capitalism going on at the highest level, that's not very attractive for investors. So it might be that Europe will benefit from investment coming our way instead.
Understood. Well, let's see how that proceeds over the next months and years to come. Now, with regard to EU enlargement, is the EU currently in a state where it can absorb the Balkan countries and Ukraine, with a question mark next to it? Because things are fairly dynamic. There is a lot of turmoil within the decision-making process, the economic policies within the EU, and so on. Is now a good time for the EU to expand?
The EU isn't immediately going to expand because there's no country that's immediately ready to join. Montenegro's the front runner, maybe concluding negotiations in the next couple of years. That's possible. And then there's a ratification process. I wouldn't put money on any country joining before 2030, but it might be that 2 or even 3 countries might join in 2030. The Balkan countries are all pretty small. And so absorbing them in terms of population and GDP would not be a big challenge for the European Union. Ukraine is another matter. Ukraine is 40 million people, less now, unfortunately, because of all those who've had to leave. But nevertheless, it's a larger country and has a larger GDP. And of course, there are all of the security issues around Ukraine. But Ukraine, I think, can go on a parallel track. So I think it's quite possible the EU could, within the next 5-6 years, enlarge to a few countries. And enlargement is always an incremental process. The EU prefers to do groups of countries because that's easier to do ratification. But also, we've seen the EU grow from 12 and then 15 countries to 28 and then 27, and it didn't have a massive impact on the EU's functioning. I think the functioning of the EU is not affected so much by having a large number of members as by how those members behave. So the question is whether might new members undermine the rule of law? Might they try to block decision making in the council, or will they be constructive member states? So I think there'll be a lot more attention in the EU to what kind of member states will they be when we get closer to the end of negotiations.
Yes, but the challenge, of course, is that when you have that kind of mix within the bloc, then decision-making simply just takes longer to happen and to implement. Now, let's talk about Ukraine just for a second here. Now, Pete Hegseth said recently that, the chances of Ukraine joining NATO are, well, negligible. What about the chances of Ukraine joining the EU? Where do you place that?
I think it's entirely possible that Ukraine will join the EU at some point, but the timescale for that happening and the circumstances under which that happened depend on the outcome of the war. The Ukrainians moved incredibly fast in applying for membership and getting ready for the start of negotiations. They did that in record time despite the war going on. The Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, has passed a lot of legislation already. The ministries have done a remarkable amount of work, given all of the problems with blackouts and the Russians destroying energy infrastructure and so on. So the political will is very clearly there on the Ukrainian side, and they've got themselves organized. But it's a long slog to EU membership, because EU membership is not just a political decision which can be taken overnight. It means taking on all of the several 100,000 pages of EU legislation, aligning with the EU standards, deciding on how exactly you're going to implement all of the EU's different regulations. That inevitably takes time, and it always takes longer for a larger country. And then if you couple that with the need for a settlement or some kind of end of the war, plus then reconstruction, that's a great opportunity to reconstruct an EU-compliant Ukraine with a lot of help from the European Union. I think that's a very good historical opportunity, but it will take time. So that's not a quick fix. NATO membership, by contrast, is something that can be done quite fast. And in fact, Ukraine, of course, having active duty soldiers, shall we say, and recent experience, unfortunately, of fighting a war is more NATO ready than some of the current members, also in terms of their defense equipment production. But of course, this all depends on the NATO members being willing to accept Ukraine. And I think there's less willingness there than there is for EU membership.
Well, quite. You have countries like Turkey, who I think is perhaps going to and ah before accepting Ukraine. What do you make of the EU's promise to Ukraine to support it for as long as it takes? Does it have enough resources? Does it have enough focus to keep providing the resources, the aeroplanes and the materiel to Ukraine as things currently stand?
Well, remember that EU member states are some of the wealthiest countries in the world, and this is an existential threat to their security. So what really matters is where is the political will to mobilize the resources to do this. And since Trump's arrival in the White House, I've seen that will strengthening. There is real concern in a lot of capitals which previously thought of themselves as not really much affected by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They're starting to think, wait a minute, the Russians really might start to enlarge the war. And it might not just be Ukraine that's affected. It could come to NATO territory. It could go to other countries outside NATO, but which are important to us strategically. I think there's a real understanding of it. And the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, remarked recently that if we don't get our act together on security and the Europeans provide help to Ukraine, then the only alternatives are either to move to New Zealand or to learn Russian. So this is focusing minds in a way that they haven't been focused since the beginning of the war, since Russia's invasion. And I think that this is the moment when the EU really will start taking decisions in the next months about joint defence procurement, about joint funding, and also about thinking about this as a security threat, not just to a neighbour, but to ourselves.
Indeed. Well, we hope for a rapid movement in that direction. Heather Grabbe, Senior Fellow at Bruegel, thank you very much for your analysis. Have a good day.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye now. That's all from this episode of World Talks. Goodbye.